we we've had a lot of fake news from the capital of fake news, which turns out to be Kiev.
Yeah.
So the second point that you're bringing up is equally important. And I think we need to understand that there has been no accountability in Washington for much of anything for a long time. And the loss of our funds that we've invested is inevitable at this point. We're never going to figure it out. We're never going to know with precision. And the reason why is that there are now 540,000 Russian troops stationed around the outskirts of Ukraine, preparing to launch one of the major offensives that I think will probably end the war in Ukraine. 540,000 Russian troops, 1,000 rocket artillery systems, 5,000 armored fighting vehicles, including at least 1,500 tanks, thousands of guns, hundreds and hundreds of tactical ballistic missiles. Ukraine is now going to experience war on a scale that we have not seen since 1945.
But Doug, we're told they were winning the war.
Make it impossible
I thought
to
Ukraine
track
was winning it. They keep propping Zelensky up like a hero, and that it's almost over.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you mention that, because the Germans are now finally discovering that what they've been told is false. About 40% of Germans polled have now said they know the narrative coming out of Berlin about Russia is false. This is starting to spread across Europe, and we're seeing demonstrations every weekend in Europe that are not being covered once again on the mainstream media here in the United States. Mm-hmm. They're anti-NATO demonstrations, they're anti-war demonstrations, because the economies of Europe have been destroyed. And by the way, you would think that a lot of Americans would wonder, since they're standing in line at the local food bank trying to get enough food to feed their families, why the president seems so intent in throwing more and more cash at Ukraine, the black hole.
Winter's going to be so bad. The Russians are surrounding us. We don't have the natural gas and the heat, so get out. Is that factual or not?
Absolutely. And in fact, the Ukrainians are moving many of their military operations centers and command and control further and further west towards the Polish border, because they can't maintain them anywhere else. You're looking at millions of Ukrainians, once again, who, if they don't have relatives in the countryside where they can bunk with them and have wood heaters or wood stoves, then that means they're going to have to head west. And we're going to have millions of Ukrainians on the doorstep of Western Europe shortly.
I think General Milley is aware of what I just described. He knows about the Russian military buildup. He knows the true state of the Ukrainian armed forces, which is miserable. And he did something that he's done before. He has a bad habit of leaking his private advice to the president, to the press. He did that to Trump, and he's done it now to Biden. And what he leaked was true, although that doesn't say much for him, because he hasn't been very truthful to this point. But I think he's afraid. I think he's afraid that we might consider intervening somehow or another in Ukraine, as Ukraine is finally and completely defeated. So I think he said the following. He said, look, the Ukrainians have done about all they can reasonably do. We shouldn't expect them to do more than they have. And secondly, this is a good time to negotiate. Actually speaking, it's not. There are no more good times to negotiate, because the Russians hold all of the cards and the Ukrainians hold nothing. The best the Ukrainians can hope for at this point is a ceasefire, and then they'll have to agree to cede large quantities of territory and end this war, because if they don't, they're going to be utterly and completely destroyed. And I think Billy knows that. So he leaked that to the New York Times because it was made clear to him by the president's advisors, the Secretary of State. Virtually everyone on the civilian side of the equation said, absolutely not. We will not negotiate. And I think the reason for that is very obvious. They do not want to admit that they were wrong, that they should have stopped this war months ago before it got started. They don't want to admit that they have been lying to the American people repeatedly about the true state of affairs on the ground in Ukraine. But Billy is afraid that he might be asked to do something, that the forces we have on the ground in Poland might be asked to do something. He doesn't want to do it. And for good reason. We're in no position to go to war with Russia. And anything that we might do on the ground would fail miserably, and we'd be embarrassed. But obviously no one is listening. And when I say no one, I mean no one in Washington. You have some Republicans, some conservatives who've raised issues about the money. But even there's no real understanding of just how desperate the situation is in Western Ukraine. So what we can look forward to, in addition to this massive offensive, is the migration of several million more Ukrainians to the west because they have nowhere else to go. And the military headquarters and most of the remaining power that exists is all being channeled to the far western part of Ukraine towards Lvov, which sits just about 20 miles from the Polish border. So Ukrainians know what's coming. There's not much they can do about it at this point. But instead of throwing them a lifeline, we've essentially told them to sink with the ship that they're on. The people on the Hill are encouraging him to continue to throw money at defense. Because remember, we ship over equipment, but most of the dollars don't go to Ukraine. They are just simply laundered through the process and end up in the pockets of donors. And the donors, when they're happy, end up subsidizing the members of the Senate and the House who support the bad policies they advocate. So this is a sort of self-licking ice cream cone. At the same time, we have no idea what happens to much of the equipment. Some of it is used, some of it is resold. We are, of course, subsidizing what remains of the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian government. They're effectively now a dependent of the United States and American largesse. But I think the great tragedy here is exactly what you just described. All of these people will benefit. Ukraine will be destroyed. Ultimately, what will emerge from all of this is probably a rump Ukraine with everything south to the Black Sea and to the east of the Dnieper River under permanent Russian control. And that rump Ukraine will be left to die on the vine as some sort of neutral territory, and no one will mention it again once it happens. I mean, what do we do whenever we go somewhere and we fail miserably and we leave? We stopped talking about it, David. We stopped talking about Vietnam after we left. We've stopped talking about Iraq and Afghanistan. We've never really talked about Libya. So wherever we go and we fail, we just stop talking and people move on to the next cash cow. Well, the armchair generals and warmongers lose interest once there's no more money in it, and they all want to cover up the failure. The danger, of course, with Ukraine is very different. I mean, right now, we could use all of those troops on the southern border. We could be saving hundreds of thousands of lives across the country by stopping the movement of the fentanyl and other illicit drugs, by stopping the human trafficking. You know, we're seeing millions of young men migrate into the United States from Latin America and other places. We know nothing about them. We don't know where they're going to end up. But these are hardly refugees in the sense that we normally think of it. So the attempt in Washington seems to be, on the one hand, to destroy everything in the United States and to try and save this, Ukrainian construct, which, frankly, is about to go out of existence. I'm beginning to think that Biden and his friends have the sort of reverse Midas touch. Everything they touch turns to garbage.
Wow.